Welcome back to our Vote 2014 coverage. I'm Scott Thuman. You heard earlier in this broadcast from Lieutenant Governor Anthony Brown, running for governor of Maryland. Now we are affording the same opportunity to the man to my right here, the Republican candidate for the governor's seat, and that is Larry Hogan. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start by talking about some new polling number. This is polling number that was commissioned by your campaign, but nonetheless, it shows a 17-point swing. You were down 12 a couple months ago, shows you up 5. Do you actually believe these numbers, that you're ahead in a Democratic state like Maryland?
Well, there have been 2 polls this week, and we've been gradually, moving up the ladder. There were polls maybe 3 weeks ago that had us within 1 or 2 points, and the most recent ones, there are 2 polls this week that have it 3 to 5 points up. But really, the only poll that counts is the one on Election Day. So we're working and running like we're way behind, and we're not going to take anything for granted. We're trying to get every single person out to vote.
The entire time, you've stuck to a pretty singular message here, and that regards taxes. You've gone over and over again against Anthony Brown on tax increases over his time as lieutenant governor. This is a tactic that seems to be working.
Well, it's not just a tactic. I started a group 3.5 years ago called Change Maryland that has become the largest and fastest growing nonpartisan citizen group in state history. 125,000 people, half of whom are Democrats and independents, and our whole been about bringing fiscal responsibility and common sense to Annapolis.
Okay, so where would you roll taxes back?
So there have been 40 consecutive tax hikes that have taken an additional $10 billion out of the pockets of struggling Maryland families and small businesses. My goal, we have a balanced budget requirement in Maryland, so you can't eliminate taxes without cutting spending. We have identified a couple of $1 billion in spending that we think we can cut out of state government, and then we're going to try to roll back as many of the 40 Brown-O'Malley increases as we possibly can.
Give me one you'd go after pretty quickly here, because the Baltimore Sun, one of many institutions that claim that both you and your opponent have been short on specifics in this race. Where would you cut?
Well, we've been talking about specifics for 3.5 years, and the first place we're going to go after is people that are on fixed incomes are the ones suffering the most. Most of these 40 tax increases are regressive taxes that hurt people on fixed incomes and lower income and middle-class families. So the first thing we talked about was trying to cut taxes on people, income taxes on retirement income, and rolling back as many of the tolls, fees, and taxes that hit people at the lower end of the income scale the most.
Lieutenant Governor Brown has promised that he's not going to make any more tax increases. Do you believe him?
You know what's funny? In the last election in 2010, both Governor O'Malley and Lieutenant Governor Brown made the exact same promise right before the largest tax increases in history and right before they raised taxes 40 times in a row. So no, I don't believe him, and he just came up with this a couple of weeks ago because he saw in the polls that we were gaining, and that my message that I've been focused on for 3.5 years is one he now wants to adopt, and nobody's buying it.
All right, let's listen very quickly to a little clip from an ad that his campaign is running.
Okay. He helped raise taxes 40 times in a row. He even taxed the rain.
That's actually not an ad from his campaign. That's from yours.
It's not even an ad that was on television. That's just a web thing.
But you think it's resonating. Yeah. I do want to, in one of his ads, he goes after you saying that when it comes to gun control, that all you're going to do is protect gun rights, that you are not going to in any way help make the community safer. In fact, he goes so far as to say that the only way that you might be willing to would be to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally unstable. Is that true? Is that the only measure you're willing to take to make it safer in Maryland?
It's complete nonsense. So, my opponent, who's been unable and unwilling to defend his 8-year record of failure on the economic issues, has run what's been called, across the country, the most negative and most dishonest advertising campaign in the entire nation. Every single word in every single one of his ads is completely false. Yeah. I've said repeatedly that we're going to enforce all the gun laws on the books. We're not going to roll back any of them. We just passed the toughest gun control laws in the entire nation, and we're going to implement those laws. What I said was that we really want to try to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill and people with criminal backgrounds, with criminal records, and this bill didn't really do that. So there may be some additional things, but there's really not much difference between the two of us, and I've been talking throughout the entire campaign about we're going to keep the laws that are on the books and enforce them.
Talk to me about an ad that's come out rather controversial in the last few days that's talking about race in this campaign, and it almost seems to imply that Marylanders need to keep the movement going. And when they say the movement, they're talking about Barack Obama, and that somehow if they don't elect a black governor, that they're missing an opportunity. Brad Bell interviewed Anthony Brown just a few moments ago, and here's what he had to say about whether or not they're playing the race card.
Our flyer was basically to remind voters that, hey, this is an important right and responsibility that many have struggled for each of us to have.
Is he playing the race card here?
Well, you know, it's not really for me to say. You know, I wouldn't have run the campaign the same way he has, that's for sure. But I can tell you that we've heard from a number of black elected officials who are Democrats, and a number of people that I've talked to in Prince George's County, Baltimore City, who are sort of outraged and insulted by these ads and these mailers that he sent out. And I don't think it's helping his campaign.
What about dreamers? You've got thousands of people who would like to stay in Maryland while they try and figure out what their status will be for immigration purposes. Well, should they be allowed to stay until it's sorted out?
Well, it's a huge problem that both the President and the Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, have failed, and they've been kicking the can down the road for years without coming up with any kind of a comprehensive, meaningful immigration reform policy, and it has to happen.
But you think there's an incentive if they're allowed to stay? You think that's a negative? If they're allowed to stay until it's sorted out?
I think we got to seal the borders and figure out what the laws are going to be and then implement the laws. And that's
in the meantime, what about
Washington.
people who are already in the state?
Well, we're going to continue to implement the exact same laws that are on the books in Maryland right now. We're going to implement the federal and state laws.
Same-sex marriage, you in favor of it?
It's passed by the voters, and it's absolutely going to stay in place. Nothing's going to change. We've said all these decisions that have been made by the voters of Maryland, I wouldn't even think about second-guessing their decisions.
Well, and I know that there's a difficulty in when you're, say you win, you're a Republican governor, you've got a very Democratic legislature dealing with. They've got essentially, what, a veto-proof 98 in the House, 35 in the Senate.
Right.
But does that then, because you can say, well, there are things I can't affect, can you affect anything? We got social media questions today saying we're just looking at more gridlock if you get elected.
Well, you know, I think what we're really looking at is checks and balances. And people are concerned that we have a monopoly now where they just roll through whatever they want. And the reason why I think we're doing so well and why I think we're going to win this race is we've talked about this really isn't a fight between Republicans and Democrats. It's about bringing people together, reaching across the aisle and trying to come up with real common sense bipartisan solutions. And we intend to work very closely with the Democrats and the Republicans in both houses of the legislature. And I think we can get a lot done.
All right, this is a race that, let's be honest, a few months ago, the polls showed a pretty big divide between you two. Now we've got Chris Christie coming for, what, his 4th visit? He's coming on Sunday to campaign for you. What does it say when you have big guns like Chris Christie devoting that much time, returning to your state multiple times, and what is he telling you right now that you can do in the last few days to actually affect this race?
Well, you know, it's interesting that this race was sort of ignored for a long, long time, and now what we have is both the Democratic Governors Association and the Republican Governors Association both focusing on it. Typically, this would be one that the Democrats would just take for granted and the Republicans would write off and not even consider. But we now are in some polls tied, in some polls we're ahead. It's really changed the dynamic. In fact, today the Cook Political Report moved this to a toss-up race.
Yeah.
It was a likely Democrat to a lean Democrat. Now it's a toss-up. And most people are saying this may be the biggest upset in the entire country.
Real quickly, we got a social media question just in from Erica. She wants to know what you are going to do when it comes to the problems with education and school spending. And I know that you've been accused of wanting to cut school spending for construction. Is that true?
It's completely false, as are most of the things that my opponent says. We're not going to cut one penny in school funding. In fact, I served as a cabinet secretary in the Ehrlich administration where we doubled spending on education. And we're going to continue to try to improve education as much as we can. We really have some very good schools here in Maryland, but we got some of the worst schools in the country, and the gap between the good schools and the bad schools is one of the worst in the entire nation, and we've got to work to make sure that every single child in Maryland has an opportunity for a world-class education.
I'm going to make you last question. I'm going to make you give me a short answer for a very complex question. It's very unfair. You've never held elected office.
Right.
What qualifies you to take this position in such a pivotal time in our nation?
I think I'm really qualified because people are fed up with career politicians that spend their entire lives in office. I'm a businessman that's been very successful, and I've been a cabinet secretary in state government and know how it works.
Larry Hogan, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.